One of the most useful concepts that I've encountered in organizing is this idea of circles of influence. And what circle of influence is basically it's imagining these three concentric circles that we have in the diagram here. The outer one is what's called our circle of concern. So these are the things that we are concerned about, the things that impact us, but that we have little influence over. So the example that I have here is whether the economy is in a recession, but it's also a lot of things. So a lot of things that where we read the news and, Trump does something and we freak out and we're, super concerned about it, but it's not something that we necessarily have a lot of influence over or something that we can do something about. That next circle in is that circle of influence. Those are the things, like I had you brainstorm in the last video, where you can ask other people to do and they'll most likely say yes. It's those things that you might not directly control, but you have an ability to influence. So for example, I can ask my neighbor to come over for dinner. They're most likely going to say yes. And then that inner circle, that circle of control, are the things that I can actually control. I can actually do them myself. So for example, I have the technical skills to put an event up on Mobilize. That is something I don't need to ask anybody else for it. I can actually do it myself. Um, and you may have worked with this idea in some slightly different ways. But for the purposes of organizing, this is something that's really, really, really useful because what goes on with this model is that our circle of influence is not fixed. So in the first video, I asked you to make a list of what you can ask the people around you to do and be reasonably confident that they'll say yes. That's sort of what makes up the second circle. And when I have you list that, I expect there are a lot of people who sort of looked at that and are like, wait, so like what? Am I supposed to defeat Trump with like a toothbrush in my kid's soccer schedule? Like, what do you want me to do here? Because it feels like what's in our circle of influence doesn't feel big enough to match what all the things are that we're concerned about. But what makes this model so powerful is that the size of your circle of influence is not fixed. It can grow or it can shrink. And when you focus on what is inside your circle of influence and use it well, your circle of influence grows. You build the skills and the relationships to make bigger and bigger asks and have more and more people say yes. If you instead focus on things outside your circle of influence, so things that concern you but you don't have the power to do anything about, you and the people around you become demoralized. You shut down and your influence shrinks. And unfortunately for us, the narratives that we have in mainstream American culture about how to make change and fight injustice encourage us to ignore what's actually in our circle of influence and fantasize imaginary solutions to things in our circle of concern. And that dominant narrative, and I write science fiction on nonviolent social change as my day job, so I can go on about this for hours. But in the short form, it's really that there's like some little band of superheroes. They're just going to go out, they're going to kick some bad guy's butt, and in a matter of months, suddenly evil has been defeated once and for all. Like, boom. Um, and it's important to be emotionally prepared that being part of an effective social movement is going to feel very, very different than that very simplistic story that a lot of us have grown up with and been taught. Um, and, at the most fundamental level, like the filmmaker doesn't know who to follow. We don't, there is no centralized command. Nobody knows everything that's going on. And we won't know until the historians go back and sift through things. Were the key actions? Who were the key people? We often don't even have a framework for situations where the key actions are collective small actions across the country that are just too big for any single filmmaker to go and follow. Um, and so this is a very, very messy movement. Social change takes place on a decades long, if you're lucky, time frame. It ebbs and it flows. We have a distributed network of people who are inspired to push in the same direction. And while we might share ideas and be inspired, no one has all the answers. And the decisions that end up being fateful ones often can't be foreseen. And the ones that do get labeled in the history books are often built on a whole bunch of individual actions and a whole bunch of an individual, basically like cultural setup and support that never makes it into the history books, and that we don't actually have a good, even cognitive framework for thinking about. And so our job is to recognize that what you are doing within your circle of influence is what you have to do. We do our piece with what we can, and we kind of have to take it on faith that other people are doing theirs. Um, we can't control other people's actions, but we can nudge it along and we can plant seeds. And we really, and I can't say this enough, have no idea what those seeds are going to grow into. And one of the most awe-inspiring things about this work for me is seeing my leaders do really cool things that I never saw coming, but being able to trace back and see like, wow, like this grew out of this chance conversation months ago. And there was no way I could have predicted that this was growing into it. But also that it wasn't just my conversation. It was my conversation, and it was a whole bunch of other little tiny things that built up into something that ends up being really cool. So what I'm saying the world looks like in real life is a bunch of micro decisions that don't seem meaningful in the moment, but collectively have a big impact. And when you know what power you have and are deliberate in how you exercise it, that is what changes the world. But it's really easy to miss those micro decisions that we need to be making if we don't have the framework to consciously be aware of when we're exercising our power and what impact it has. So for this next exercise, what I want you to do is I want you to pay attention just for a day to where your attention goes. How much of your time and energy are you spending on things that are in your circle of influence versus your circle of concern? And something that can be very surprising to people is simply realizing how much of their time and emotional energy is being drained into their circle of concern. And I really want you to be very attentive to what we talked about earlier in this video, which is that you grow your power and influence by paying attention to what is in your circle of influence. And that is really where, as you look over your life, you might want to think about just a little bit, am I putting my time and energy where I want to? Am I putting my time and energy into things that are going to grow my capacity, my energy, my relationships, my skills?